I'm Stephen Nelson. I'm here in Tokyo, Japan on a sunny morning, sunny Sunday morning. Today I'm going to talk to you about the 13-stringed Zither that is played in Japan. It is played in gagaku, but it was played very differently back in the ancient and medieval periods. I'm going to try and talk about that. I believe that you all have some materials that Alan sent you by email. It would be good if you could look at those and follow along because my screen is rather small and a little hard to see. To begin, when I talk about the main source of Japanese gagaku, being the music and dance of the Chinese Tang dynasty, I am often greeted with skepticism, especially from Chinese scholars and musicians who listen to today's gagaku and say that it sounds nothing like Chinese music. That is true, in a way, since the music has changed fundamentally since it was brought from China. There is, however, an overwhelming body of evidence that much of this music was brought to Japan from China, mainly by Japanese missions, missions with musicians who visited China as members of official missions, about 20 or so official missions to the Sui and the Tang courts, and also by Chinese musicians who took the music themselves to Japan. In this connection, there have been a couple of interesting discoveries in recent years. Both were made by the Japanese gagaku scholar, Professor Endo Toru of Tokyo Gakugei University. Both are extensive piece lists that date from 10th century Japan. The first, which Professor Endo discovered only a couple of years ago, is a catalogue of musical terms and repertoire compiled by the Tang flute player Heguri no Hideshige in 928. The list of pieces in this catalogue gives 194 piece names altogether. This is a photograph of 2 pages out of the 36 pages of the source. It shows the beginning of the list of pieces in the mode hyojo. Sometimes only the piece name is given. Sometimes there is a lot of detail about the musical form of the piece written in smaller characters. The second discovery was made about 15 years ago. It is the complete table of contents of the flute score Hakuga no Fuefu, which was compiled by Minamoto no Hiromasa in 966. This table of contents gives a total of 196 pieces altogether. This photograph shows the names of the pieces in the hyojo mode and also in the taishikicho mode. Only the names of the pieces are given. If we compare the piece lists in the 2 sources, allowing for some miscopying and classification of pieces into different modal classes, we find that approximately 85% of the piece names can be found in both lists. The question is, what percentage of these pieces are Chinese in origin? In a paper that I gave at a symposium in Shanghai in 2008, I compared the piece names given in the 12 modal classes in the table of contents of Hakuga no Fuefu with 2 things. First of all, the names of pieces in 8th century Chinese sources. I've listed them here and in the materials. I won't read the names because my Chinese is terrible. However, I also compared it to the attribution of pieces to Japanese composers in Japanese sources. The results are in this table. This is very detailed, but I won't go into detail. Let me summarize. Approximately 40% of the Japanese togaku repertoire can be found in the 8th century Chinese sources. Just under a quarter of them are known to be Japanese compositions, and about another 40% remain of unknown origin. I believe that many in this 3rd category, the pieces with unknown origins, may actually prove to be of Chinese origin if we extend our search more widely to other Chinese sources. Of course, we must be very careful not to assume that the identity of Chinese and Japanese names immediately implies the identity of the pieces of music themselves, but I believe that we are correct to conclude that a large portion of the Japanese togaku repertoire, perhaps as much as 70 or 80%, is indeed derived from Chinese musical practice of the Tang and perhaps earlier dynasties. Japan preserves much musical notation with Tang dynasty origins. Japan preserves a large body of tablature scores for the ensemble music of the Tang repertoire. Sources dating from the ancient to early medieval period, that is 8th to 13th centuries, can be found for several instruments, including the 5-stringed lute, the 4-stringed lute, the transverse flute, and the 13-string zither. Since I'm talking about the zither today, I'm limiting myself only to zither sources. We have 3 important sources that still survive from the ancient period: Jinchi-yoroku and Ruiso-chiyo, the first and second here, are complete or almost complete sources with many, many pieces. A third source is older, but only has a very small number, about 28 pieces altogether. I am using the first source, Jinchi-yoroku, for my presentation today. In addition to these 3 surviving sources, when we look at the old materials, we can see that there were many other collections of notation which have since been lost. This is a list. I won't go through that in detail. I would just like to point out first, the first source is a score that was brought from China by a Chinese musician called Sun Bin in 845. The rest of the sources were written or compiled by Japanese emperors, politicians who had very great musical talents, or members of the noble class, and in later centuries, Buddhist priests and professional musicians. That we have a very, very strong record of a tradition of the use of tablature notation in performance, and this is a surviving record of that. Now, let's get a little bit concrete. Now, this instrument, the koto, the sono koto or koto in Japanese, came from China. Now, since the ancient period, its performance practice has changed dramatically. First, there have been changes in the tunings. At the moment, all of the tunings on this instrument are pentatonic from top to bottom with only 5 notes per octave. However, in the Heian period, some of the tunings were not pentatonic, but were heptatonic, that is, with 7 notes available. I will explain that in concrete detail in just a moment. The second change, the loss of left-hand techniques. Now, in gagaku, they never use the left hand. It is put on the instrument like this, and it never moves. Mottainai. And then the third one. There were many pieces for solo performance on this instrument, many solo pieces, but they have largely been lost from the repertoire. Okay, the sono koto, 13-string zither, it came to China, it came to Japan from China by the 8th century at the latest. 13 strings, my instrument has silk strings, and the gagaku instrument even today tends to use silk strings. We tune it, of course, by changing the positions of the movable bridges. The tunings are largely pentatonic, and the tablature notation is made up of string names, 1 to 10 in Chinese characters, and then 3 more for the 11th, 12th, and 13th strings. This is the instruction. You probably can't see it. This is in my materials, so you can check this later if you're interested. There is instructions about how to tune the instrument in the hyojo mode. It's very long. It's telling you how to tune each string and then explaining the scale. If you read this, you end up with a tuning which sounds like this. It's a little strange because there are places where they're not octaves. Let me play it with things that should be octaves or unisons. There are two places where it's a major seventh rather than an octave, 3 and 8. Now what they do in performance is push the 8th string upwards to give an octave. Like that. The same with 6 and 11. So there's much use made of the left hand to produce consonant octaves. Next, these are the instructions for playing the instrument, which is again in scroll 1 of Jinshi Yoroku. I can't look at all of these today, so I just like these involve string names, right-hand techniques, left-hand techniques, and rhythm. Now, today I just like to have a look at the left-hand techniques. I hope you can see this, perhaps not. Maybe you'll be able to see some things. In the notation, there are red dots and little red hooks which indicate certain things. For instance, if there's an 8 with a dot, a red dot in the right hand lower corner, that means that you push the string up. Instead of playing, you play, so you push it up a half tone. Next, if there's a dot at the top right hand corner, then you do that, but you let go of the string halfway through, like this. So you get a descending figure. Next, if there are 2 dots, you combine the 2 this way. So you get a mordant or an inverted mordant in terms of Western music terminology. A note that goes down and comes back to the original height. The next one is a little hook on the top right-hand side of the instrument of the tablature sign. I think this is the first stroke of the right-hand part of this character. Shu in Japanese, of course, in Chinese, chu, I think. But this indicates another mordant, but played by pulling the string rather than pushing the string, like this. So you produce this mordant, which in Japanese is called yu. They use the character yu in Chinese, yo, to indicate this movement down and back. This is the U produced by pulling, and this is the U produced by pushing. Okay, let me just go on. Now, you may not be able to see this notation. This is the notation of a piece called Senkin Joshi from Jinshi Yoroku. There are lots of tablature signs which have the red dots in them. Now, this piece may derive from an ancient piece for the 7-stringed zither, the chin or guchin, because there are pieces with similar names in the very, very old chin notation. Yolang, my Chinese is horrible, I'm sorry, Yolang. This is a source that is kept in Tokyo now in the National Museum, but there are 2 piece names here which use senkin or qianjin. And perhaps the piece that I'm going to play now derives from the Qin repertoire. I think that probably in Japan, they transferred this piece from the Qin to the zither as the Qin performance practice died out. This is the piece. It's divided into 10 phrases by a little red line. Now, let me talk about the form of the piece before I play it. The first phrase and the 5th phrase are the same. And the beginning of the 3rd phrase also has the same motif. In addition, there is a cadential or final figure, which is the same in 4 places. It is extended at the very end. Now, I'm going to play this piece using a plectra, perhaps they played this with their fingers originally, but because this is a Zoom connection and not very good, I want to make the sound a little sharper, so I'm going to use the plectrum. So let me begin. So that's a fairly typical solo piece for this instrument. Lastly, I'd just like to talk very quickly about how this instrument was used in ensemble performance. In ensemble performance, much use is made of octave figures on strong beats and then notes played with the thumb on weak beats. Just to give you an idea and also a hint as to what we might hear later in today's symposium, let me play the piece 五小楽の9、武昌乐集。Okay, that's it. It may have been slower, it may have been faster, we have no idea about the tempo, but later today you may hear an ensemble performance of this piece. Thank you very much.